My name is Brene Brown, and I am a shame and empathy researcher at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. I am the author of I Thought It Was Just Me: Women Reclaiming Power and Courage in a Culture of Shame. So, when I first started this work, I was so excited to finally get an understanding of shame and what it meant and why so many of us have turned over big parts of our lives to it. So, when I first started the work, I was really passionate about talking about the what is it and how does it work. I wanted to explain to people, here's what I'm learning about shame. Here's how it works in our lives. Because the thing probably a year into this research, I knew three things. One, we've all got it. Two, no one wants to talk about it. And three, the less we talk about it, the more power we turn over to it. So in the beginning, I really focused on the what is shame and how does it work? What is empathy? How does it work? And as I would talk to people, I started to hear the why question more than any other question. People were interested in the what is it and how does it work? But what people really wanted to know is why. Why are you studying this? And why are you insisting that we talk about this? Because, the truth is, these are tough topics. When you tell people that you study shame, vulnerability, and empathy, they kind of look at you like, wow, were all the other topics taken, or did you draw the short straw in research school? But that's not the case. So people, and that's a mindful question. Why do you study this, and why do you think we should talk about it? And so that's where I like to start. And what's interesting about my answer is that when I could not have answered the question why shame and empathy 6 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe even 4 years ago. But now, after talking to hundreds of men and women around the country about shame and how it affects the way they live, love, parent, work, build relationships, I finally, for the first time and probably in my career, understand why. If you think about connection, and I talk a lot about connection in my work. Connection is our ability to forge meaningful, authentic relationships with other people. I believe that connection is the essence of the human experience. It is what breathes lives and gives meaning to our lives. If you think about connection on a continuum, what I have learned is that anchoring this end of that continuum is empathy. It is what moves us toward deep, meaningful relationship. On the other side of the continuum connection is shame. It absolutely unravels our relationships and our connections with other people. And so to study shame and empathy and to ask people to engage in a national conversation about these things just for the sake of knowing shame and empathy, I think it might be too big of a question, too big of a favor to ask people to talk about it just for that sake. But what I have learned is that if we want to understand connection, if we want to understand what really fills our human spirit, we have to understand what anchors both ends of that continuum. The vulnerability piece is, if you imagine this continuum almost like an equalizer on a stereo, and it has a little knob that you can move, that knob is vulnerability. When we are in our best vulnerability, meaning open, willing to share not only our strengths with people, but our struggles, that moves us towards empathy. Empathy is about being vulnerable with people in their vulnerability. It's about being with folks. If you slide that knob on the continuum, over to shame, that's vulnerability at its worst. That's when I can't let you see these pieces of me because I fear that it will cause disconnection. Three of the big questions I want to answer in my research, where shame and vulnerability and empathy are central, have to do with courage, compassion, and connection. And so I'd like to kind of go through each of those. The first one is courage. When courage first came into the English language, it had a very simple definition. It comes from the Latin word cur, which means heart. And courage meant to speak your mind with your heart, to tell your story. I think over time that definition has changed in terms of the way we use it. But if you think about courage, and I use the term ordinary courage, which I read in an article by Annie Rogers. If you think about ordinary courage, telling our story, how do we do that in a culture of fear? Shame breeds three things: fear, blame, and disconnection. So how do we practice courage in a culture where we are incredibly afraid of not fitting in? How do I tell you my stories about those imperfect moments in my life, about the time when I was just not the mom that I wanted to be, about the time where I really screwed up at work and I lost the client, that I have a partner who's deep into addiction and I'm afraid for people to know because I don't want them to stop caring about my partner or question my judgment in terms of being with him or her. How do I tell these stories, which is the only way that we get out from underneath shame, in a culture where belonging and fitting in and being accepted are so critically important? So we're in this culture right now. What hasn't changed for us as people is the fact that we're wired for story. From the beginning of human time, we are wired to tell our stories. We're not born to keep secrets. We're not born, hating things about us and not sharing them with other people. We're born to tell our stories. So it's not people who have changed. It's the culture that's changed. And so how do we embrace and share the imperfections that make us who we are in a culture where we're afraid to not fit in? The second piece is compassion, and that is really in an important way related to story, because stories are only a form of connection when someone's listening and hearing us. So how do we have the courage to tell our story? But then where do we find the compassion to hear other people's stories? One thing that's real important to understand about shame is that while it's universal and all of us have it, it's triggered for all of us in very different ways. Maybe for me it's about body image or parenting or sex or addiction. For someone else it might be about providing, money, aging, religion. One thing that's universal about it is just listening to shame can be shaming for us. So if you were to share your story with me, how do I stay open and sit in that with you, as opposed to moving into blame and judgment?